What really happened during Aragorn's 87 lost years. LOTR lore. There is a version of Aragorn that the films gave you. A brooding ranger, a reluctant king, a man who spent decades haunting the edges of the Shire, drinking alone in prancing pony common rooms, waiting for a destiny he could not quite bring himself to claim. That version of Aragorn is moving. It is well acted. It is also, if you follow the text carefully, almost completely wrong. Not invented, not unfaithful to the spirit, but wrong in the specific, consequential way that a photograph of the outside of a building is wrong about what happens inside it. Because what Tolkien actually wrote, scattered across appendices and letters and the dense archaeological layers of unfinished tales, is the story of a man who spent 87 years not wandering in sorrow but working, conducting a sustained, dangerous, largely solitary campaign against the servants of Sauron across some of the most hostile territory in Middle-earth, operating under false names in foreign armies, striking Gondor's enemies from the sea, penetrating into Rhûn and Harad, the east and the deep south, territories so far inside the shadow of the enemy that Tolkien's maps show them, but his prose almost never enters them. And then coming back and saying almost nothing. This is the question this video is going to sit with. Did Aragorn conceal the full truth of those 87 years from Gandalf, from Frodo, from the Fellowship, because he was protecting them from the scale of what he knew? Or because after nearly a century of living as someone else, he was no longer entirely certain who Aragorn was? That question has no clean answer, but following it all the way down changes everything you think you understand about the man who walked into Moria. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. This is what the text actually says when you read it all the way through. Let us start with what we are actually given. Appendix A of The Return of the King contains something called The Tale of Aragorn and Arwen. It is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of writing Tolkien ever produced, and it is also, for our purposes, one of the most strategically evasive. It covers Aragorn's life from his birth in Third Age 2931 to his death in Fourth Age 120, and it does so with a selectivity that can only be called deliberate. Entire decades pass in a sentence. Major events are named without being described. The emotional weight of a life spanning 210 years is compressed into something you could read in 40 minutes, and the compression is not accidental. Tolkien knew what he was leaving out. Here is what Appendix A actually gives us for the period we care about. Aragorn is told his true name and lineage by his mother Gilrain, and by Elrond when he turns 20, in Third Age 2951. He falls in love with Arwen that same year, walks in the woods of Rivendell, and understands for the first time what it will cost him to be what he is. Elrond, knowing this, sends him away. He goes out into the wild, Tolkien writes, and that phrase, that single phrase, covers the next 6 years, until Third Age 2957, when something more specific begins. From 2957 to roughly 2980, he serves, Tolkien says, in the armies of Rohan and Gondor, under a false name. In Unfinished Tales, the chapter on the history of Gondor's stewards and kings fills in the name, Thorongil, Eagle of the Star. A wandering captain who appeared in Rohan under Thengel the king proved himself extraordinary in the field, and then moved south to serve Ecthelion II in Minas Tirith. No origins given, no lineage claimed. Just capability and silence, and the kind of presence that made men follow him without understanding why. Then, after the Corsair raid at Umbar, that Unfinished Tales describes in detail, Thorongil vanishes. He sends word that he must leave, that he goes east where great need calls, and he is not seen in Gondor again. And here is where Tolkien's chronology goes silent, in a way that should stop you cold. From roughly Third Age 2980, when Aragorn returns briefly to Rivendell to see Arwen, to Third Age 3018, when he meets Frodo in Bree, there are 38 years that Appendix A essentially skips. and the 23 years before that, the Thorongil period, are described in less detail than most people spend describing a single year of their life. 87 years, almost entirely off the page. Now ask yourself why. Pay attention to this next part, because it is where the evasiveness of the text stops being a literary choice and starts being a character choice. Tolkien wrote expansively about almost everything he cared about. The Silmarillion alone is thousands of years of history, rendered in granular, almost painful detail. The appendices of The Lord of the Rings run to hundreds of pages, covering linguistic drift, royal genealogies, the history of calendars. When Tolkien chose not to dramatize something, that choice was never casual. It was always meaningful. He did not write Aragorn's 87 years in detail. And in Letter 244, responding to a reader's question about what Aragorn actually did during those years, Tolkien says, with the brevity of a man confirming something he considers almost too obvious to state, that Aragorn traveled in Rhûn and Harad, the east and the south, gathering knowledge of the enemy's strength and the peoples under his dominion. Full stop. That is all he says. And that sentence contains a world. Picture this. Third Age 2980, somewhere east of the Anduin. The maps end here for most people in Middle-earth. There is no Rivendell, no Minas Tirith, no Shire to anchor you. There is only the long, flat expanse of territory that Tolkien associated, from the earliest layers of his cosmology, with the shadow of Morgoth and then of Sauron. The men who live here have civilizational memories shaped entirely by the enemy. Their stories about creation, about power, about what the world is and what it is for, flow through channels that Sauron has been widening for 3,000 years. And walking through this, wearing a name that is not his name, is a man from the West who looks like just another traveler, except that he cannot entirely stop himself from seeing the deep structure of everything around him with the eyes of someone who has read the lore of the First Age and understands where this shadow came from. He is 30 years old at this point. He will live another 180 years. He has time. That is perhaps the most unsettling thing about him. He has time in a way that no one around him does, and he knows it, and he uses it, because that is what the blood of Númenor gives you, when it runs as strongly as it runs in him. Not immortality, not immunity to grief or cold or hunger, just more years than any normal man can imagine, and the clarity that comes from knowing exactly how you intend to spend them. He is there to understand, to see, firsthand, what Sauron's hold on these peoples actually looks like from the inside. To know, not in the abstract way that Elrond knows it from reports, but in the bone-deep way that only direct experience grants, how completely and how permanently the enemy has shaped the East and the South. And he will bring almost none of that knowledge back to the light in any documented form. Now here is where it gets strange. The Silmarillion, in the Ainulin Dale and the Valaquenta, establishes a cosmological principle that runs through everything Tolkien wrote. Evil cannot create. It can only corrupt. It can only work with what already exists, bending it, distorting it, convincing it that the distortion is natural. This is true of the great music. It is true of the Rings of Power. It is true of the men of the East and South, who were not created as servants of Morgoth, but were, over immense stretches of time, taught to be. Aragorn, walking through Rhûn and Harad, was not looking at inherently dark people. He was looking at the long-term results of the enemy's patience. He was seeing what 3 ages of sustained spiritual manipulation does to a civilization. What it looks like when an entire culture's understanding of good and evil has been quietly inverted over millennia, so that service to Sauron feels, from the inside, like loyalty to something true. That is not a comfortable thing to see. And Aragorn saw it, and remembered it, and we have almost no record of what he concluded. What we do have is a single line from Appendix A, when Aragorn finally returns to Rivendell after these campaigns. After Rhûn and Harad and the unnamed years between, Elrond looks at him, and says something that Tolkien renders with almost insulting understatement. He says, "You have grown." Think about what that means. This is Elrond half-elven saying this, a man who was born in the First Age, who fought in the War of Wrath, who watched Númenor fall from a distance and spent the entire Third Age holding the line against Sauron's return. A man who has seen more than almost any living being in Tolkien's world. When he looks at Aragorn and says, "You have grown," he is not commenting on the size of Aragorn's shoulders. He is recognizing a qualitative change, something that transcends the accumulation of years and skills and experiences. Something in the nature of who Aragorn has become that is visible to eyes capable of seeing it. And Tolkien gives him 3 words for it. You have grown. That restraint is the point. What Elrond saw, he saw. What Aragorn had become, he had become. And neither of them, apparently, felt the need to elaborate. Here is something that nobody asks directly enough. What does it do to a person, any person, to live under a false name for decades? Not as a temporary disguise, not as a short-term operational cover, but as a sustained, daily, years-long performance of being someone other than who you are, to answer to a different name, to accept praise and loyalty, and trust under that other name, to build genuine relationships, genuine respect, genuine love from the men who follow you into battle, all while knowing that none of them know what they are actually following. Aragorn was Thorongil in Gondor and Rohan for roughly 23 years. That is not a disguise. That is a life. People who fought beside Thorongil went home and told their children about him. Ecthelion II praised him to his own son Denethor, praised the strange captain from the north who bested the corsairs at Umbar, not knowing that Denethor would one day find himself in a terrible relationship with the man Thorongil actually was. Those soldiers who bled beside Thorongil at Umbar, who watched him lead a night raid into the harbor with the kind of tactical precision that only comes from someone who has thought about nothing else for years, they trusted Thorongil. They gave him something real. And Aragorn took it, held it, used it well, and then walked away from it without explanation. Unfinished Tales is explicit on this point. When Thorongil departs after Umbar, he leaves a letter for Ecthelion. He says he must go east, where great need awaits, and he will not return to Gondor. He does not explain. He does not reveal himself. He does not even stay long enough to receive the honors that Ecthelion was preparing to give him. From a tactical standpoint, this is correct. His cover required it. Revealing himself would have ended the mission, created political complications, potentially endangered everything. He made the right call. He made the right call every time, apparently, across decades, which is its own kind of extraordinary. But the right call and the easy call are not the same thing. And after 23 years of being Thorongil, after building something real under that name and then walking away from it, the question of what Aragorn felt as he crossed the Anduin heading east is one that Tolkien does not answer. Because Aragorn would not have put it in the record. That is the thing, that is the absolutely essential thing about this man, that the films never quite captured and the books only gesture at from a careful distance. He did not put things in the record. The Ranges of the North. This is the second lore layer, and it changes the whole frame. Appendix A describes the Dunedain of the North, Aragorn's people, the remnant of the kingdom of Arthedain after the fall of Arnor in Third Age 1975. By the time Aragorn is born, they are a small group, scattered, without a city or a king, moving through the wild lands of Eriador in small companies, maintaining a watch over territory that most of the people living in it have entirely forgotten was once protected. Including the Shire. The hobbits of the Shire, the appendices confirm, lived in peace and ignorance of how that peace was maintained. The rangers kept the roads. They tracked the movements of orcs, of wargs, of darker things. They pushed back the gradual encroachment of Sauron's servants without ever revealing themselves to the people they were protecting, without ever being thanked, without any of the institutional support or recognition that makes sustained sacrifice bearable. And Aragorn was their chieftain, their captain, their king in everything but name. He led this people, these last soldiers of a dead kingdom, for decades before the War of the Ring began. And those decades of thankless, quiet, unrecorded watch, alongside the campaigns in Gondor and the missions to the east and south, represent the full texture of his so-called lost years. He was not wandering. He was working, constantly, deliberately, across a front so wide and a timeline so long that no single person could have held it all in view, except him. Now hold this alongside what Tolkien writes in the same appendix about why the Dunedain did what they did. They bore the brunt of the defense of the North and the Shire, he says, and they did it without expectation of recognition or reward, because they understood something that most people never understand, that civilization is not self-maintaining, that the peace people take for granted is the product of decisions made in the dark by people who chose to make those decisions and never told anyone. That is the world Aragorn grew up in. That is the institution that shaped him, before Elrond shaped him, before the campaigns shaped him. The Rangers were his first and most fundamental model of what it meant to serve, and they served in silence, and he learned from them before he learned anything else. Picture this: Aragorn at 20 years old, the year he learns his name, standing in Rivendell's library, reading the history of the Dunedain for the first time, with the knowledge that it is his history. The fall of Arnor, the loss of the Palantir at Annúminas, the slow retreat of his people into the wild, the centuries of diminishment, each generation smaller and more scattered than the last, and yet still holding, still watching, still maintaining the line between the remembered world and the forgotten one. He is 20 years old, and he understands, in this moment, not just who he is, but what he is for. Not a king waiting to return, a watchman, a keeper of something that most people have already stopped believing in. And then he goes out into the wild and becomes exactly that for the next 87 years. The Corsair raid at Umbar. This is the moment that Unfinished Tales gives us in the most detail, and it is worth understanding what it actually was. Umbar was not a pirate nuisance. Umbar was a strategic catastrophe waiting to happen to Gondor, a fortified harbor held by men who were, Tolkien confirms, descended from black Númenóreans, those of Númenórean blood who had allied themselves with Sauron before the downfall of that island kingdom. They had been raiding Gondor's southern coasts for generations, disrupting trade, threatening the harbor at Pelargir, stretching Gondor's military capacity in a direction it could not easily sustain, while also watching the east. Thorongil proposed the raid to Ecthelion II, planned it, led it, took a small fleet south in the night, struck the Corsair harbor, burned the ships in dock, killed the Lord of the Haven, and withdrew before a full response could be organized. This is not a footnote. This is a decisive military operation that altered the strategic balance of the south in Gondor's favor by decades. The Corsairs of Umbar were significantly weakened, and they would not recover fully until they were able to raid again during the War of the Ring, which Aragorn then dealt with using the army of the dead. Consider that. He neutralized Umbar twice, once as Thorongil with fire and steel, and once as Aragorn with oath-bound ghosts. And the second time, he was finally able to do it as himself. But in Third Age 2980, immediately after the first victory, Thorongil was gone. Unfinished Tales says that Denethor, who was already Ecthelion's trusted heir, and who had developed a profound wariness of Thorongil's influence over his father, was not unhappy to see him go. This detail is easy to miss, and important not to miss, because Denethor is not a fool. Denethor is one of the most intelligent and perceptive people in Tolkien's world, capable of wielding a Palantir and holding his own against Sauron's influence longer than perhaps any other man alive could have done. And Denethor looked at Thorongil and felt something he could not fully name, a wrongness. A sense that this wandering captain was not what he presented himself as. He was right. He just could not prove it. And Aragorn, perhaps sensing this, perhaps knowing that Denethor's suspicion would eventually become dangerous, chose the moment of his greatest triumph to disappear, to take the victory and vanish before the questions could solidify into something he could not evade. This is the operational discipline of someone who has been doing this for a very long time. Because here is what that actually means. Aragorn was in his late 40s at this point. He had been living under assumed identities for over 20 years. He had developed, across those years, a specific skill that is never named but runs through everything we know about him. The skill of knowing when to disappear, of taking the measure of a situation and understanding, before anyone else did, that the moment to vanish had arrived, of walking away from recognition, from reward, from the relationships that recognition builds, because the mission required it. This is not humility. Humility is when you have the option to accept honor and choose not to. What Aragorn was doing was more disciplined than that. He was maintaining a strategic cover across a multi-decade operation, and he was doing it with such precision that even a man as perceptive as Denethor could never pin down exactly what felt wrong about Thorongil, only that something did. By the time Aragorn met Frodo in Bree, he had been practicing this specific discipline for decades. The evasion, the understatement, the precise revelation of only what the situation required, and not one syllable more. The prancing pony scene in The Fellowship of the Ring is one of the great dramatic entrances in English literature, and it is easy to read it as Tolkien establishing Aragorn's mystery. The brooding stranger in the corner, the two knowing eyes, the pipe and the sudden appearance from shadow. But read it again knowing what we know. That man in the corner has just spent years in Rhûn and Harad. He has led a naval raid that changed the military balance of an entire region. He has watched companions die, unnamed, without monument. He has maintained a false identity for longer than Frodo has been alive. He has been chieftain of a people so depleted that most of the world has forgotten they exist, holding a watch over lands that the people he was protecting were entirely ignorant of. And he is sitting in a corner of the prancing pony in Bree, watching 4 hobbits draw attention to themselves with the perfect stillness of a man who has spent most of his adult life not drawing attention to himself, and he is deciding, very carefully, exactly how much to reveal. Not because he does not trust them, he trusts Frodo with his life from the moment he sees the ring, but because full revelation is not something Aragorn does reflexively, it is something he does deliberately, after calculation, only to the degree the situation demands. He tells them his name is Strider. He tells them he is a friend of Gandalf. He tells them he knows the road to Rivendell. He tells them exactly as much as they need to know to trust him enough to follow him, and not one word more. He has been doing that for 87 years. Now we come to the question of what Rhûn and Harad actually cost him. Because Tolkien confirms the geography of those missions, but not the details, and the silence around the details is where the most important speculation lives. Rhûn, in the cosmological framework Tolkien establishes across the Silmarillion and the appendices, was the ancient home of the Easterlings, men who had allied themselves with Morgoth in the First Age and never fully recovered from that allegiance. Sauron had been working on them since the Second Age, building on Morgoth's foundation, deepening the channels of dominion that already ran through their culture. By the Third Age, they were among Sauron's most reliable military assets, sending wave after wave of men westward in the major conflicts of the age. Harad, the south, was similar. The Haradrim, the Southrons who appear in the Two Towers when Faramir and his rangers ambush their column, were described by Sam Gamgee as men with the same hearts as other men, capable of being on the wrong side. That observation is devastating in a quiet way, and Sam makes it almost accidentally, but it is one of the most theologically significant moments in the entire trilogy, because it means that the men Aragorn encountered in Harad were not monsters, they were people. People shaped, over generations, by a power that had taught them the world was otherwise than it was, and who believed what they had been taught because they had no access to any other story. Aragorn spent significant time among these people. He could not have gathered intelligence effectively without doing so. He could not have assessed the scope of Sauron's alliances without understanding the societies that had entered those alliances, and that meant getting close enough to see them as Sam saw them, as men with the same hearts, men who were fighting for something they believed in, on behalf of an enemy who had shaped their beliefs specifically to serve his purposes. What does that do to a person? The Númenórean philosophy of war, as Tolkien develops it through figures like Faramir in particular, held that it was possible to be a warrior without cruelty, to love and understand what you fought, even as you fought it. Faramir represents this ideal within the text. He is the scholar soldier, the man who grieves the death of the Southron soldier because he does not know what life had shaped that man into the enemy position. That philosophy did not come from nowhere. It came from a lineage, an intellectual and spiritual inheritance that traced back through the Dúnedain to Númenor itself. Aragorn shared that inheritance. He had read what Faramir had read, and more. He had thought about what Faramir had thought about, and for longer. And then he went and lived among the people who, in the War of the Ring, would be on the other side of the field. He knew them. He had probably sat beside their fires, eaten their food, perhaps, to maintain cover, participated in their rituals, listened to their stories, watched their children grow up in the shadow of a dominion they did not fully understand as dominion. He had seen the enemy's work from the inside, not as an abstract evil to be opposed, but as a lived reality that organized the daily existence of millions of people. And he brought that knowledge back, and he almost never mentioned it. Picture this: the Council of Elrond, Third Age, 3018. The great chamber in Rivendell, Elrond at the center, Gandalf beside him, Frodo with the ring, and the representatives of every free people who have survived to this moment, gathered to decide what to do about a crisis that has been building for 3,000 years. Aragorn is in that room. He has been in Rhûn and Harad. He has seen the armies Sauron is assembling, the peoples he has bent to his purpose, the full eastern and southern arc of his alliances. He knows the scale of what the West is facing, with a specificity that nobody else in that room possesses, because he is the only one who has been there. Gandalf knows Sauron's power. Elrond knows his history. But Aragorn knows his recruitment pool. He knows how many men are out there who will march west under the Dark Lord's banner, because their entire civilization has been preparing them to do exactly that for longer than anyone in that room has been paying attention. He does not say this in the council. He says almost nothing in the council except to confirm his lineage and claim Isildur's Bane as a name. He defers to Gandalf on the history. He defers to Elrond on the cosmological stakes. He says, essentially, that the shards of Narsil are here, and that he intends to seek the heir of Isildur's sword. He is, at this moment, the most dangerous intelligence asset in the room, and he is managing the room with the careful restraint of a man who has learned, over decades, that full disclosure is almost never the right operational choice. Why? That is the question this video is really asking, and it has at least two answers, and they are not mutually exclusive, and the weight of which one you believe shifts the meaning of everything that follows. The first answer is tactical. Aragorn in the Council of Elrond is still running an operation. The operation now is the Fellowship, the mission to destroy the ring, and what that mission needs from him is not a full intelligence briefing on Sauron's eastern alliances. It needs him to inspire confidence, to project certainty, to be, for Frodo and the others, the anchor of capability and will that the mission requires. A full accounting of how vast and deep and old and settled Sauron's power is in the east and south would not inspire confidence. It would undermine it, so he does not give it. He gives them what they need, which is the sight of a man who has seen the shadow and is not broken by it, and he keeps what they do not need locked somewhere behind those eyes. The second answer is harder. After 87 years of being someone other than Aragorn, he may not have been entirely sure where the operational discipline ended and the self began. The Unfinished Tales section on Númenórean kings describes the extraordinary longevity and endurance of those with pure Númenórean blood, noting that this longevity was not simply additional years, but a quality of vitality, a sustained capacity for experience and change, that meant a man like Aragorn at 100 years old was not a man made ancient by time, but a man made deeper by it, still capable of being shaped, still accumulating, still, in some fundamental sense, becoming. But becoming requires material, and for 87 years, most of the material Aragorn was becoming from was the experience of being someone else. Thorongil, the wanderer in the east, the unnamed chieftain of a hidden people, the stranger in Rhûn who watched and listened and never spoke his true name. He had inhabited these identities so completely, for so long, that the return to Aragorn, the reclamation of that name and lineage and destiny, was not a return to a waiting self. It was a construction project. Elrond saw the result. "You have grown," he said, "but growing is not the same as remembering." And the Aragorn who finally came home was not the 20-year-old who had walked out of Rivendell with the weight of his lineage newly settled on his shoulders. He was someone who had spent nearly a century testing that weight against some of the hardest realities in the world, and the testing had changed him in ways that the original version of himself would not have fully recognized. This is where the films get it exactly backwards. The films show us an Aragorn who doubts whether he is worthy of the throne, who fears he will repeat Isildur's failure, who needs the fellowship and Arwen and the example of Frodo's courage to convince him to step into his destiny. And this is a coherent and genuinely moving story. But it is the story of a man whose problem is self-confidence, and the canon Aragorn's problem is not self-confidence. The canon Aragorn had spent 87 years doing things that required extraordinary self-confidence to attempt. He led armies in foreign kingdoms under false names. He raided enemy harbors at night. He penetrated the most dangerous territories on the map, alone or in small groups, gathering intelligence about an enemy so powerful that most of the great elven and mortal leaders in his world were afraid to look at him directly. He did all of this. He was not lacking in belief in his own capability. What he was is something different, something more complicated and more interesting. He was a man who had practiced self-erasure as a survival skill for so long that self-assertion had become foreign to him. Not frightening, not psychologically blocked, just unfamiliar. Like a language you spoke fluently as a child but have not used in decades, still there in you, the structures intact, but requiring an effort to retrieve that fluency that feels disproportionate to those around you who never stopped speaking it. Claiming the throne of Gondor was not Aragorn overcoming fear. It was Aragorn forcing himself to speak, loudly and in public and without disguise, a language he had deliberately suppressed for nearly a century, because suppressing it was the only way to do the work that needed to be done. That is a different kind of courage than the films show us. It is less cinematic. It is harder to portray in a face, but it is, I think, what Tolkien actually wrote. And here is where it gets philosophically interesting. Letter 244, the letter where Tolkien confirms the Rhûn and Harad missions, also contains something else, something that does not get quoted nearly often enough. Tolkien writes, in the context of explaining what the years of wandering were for, that Aragorn was not merely gathering intelligence, but was testing his own fitness for the task ahead. That the purpose of those years was partly external, understanding Sauron's reach, and partly internal, understanding his own. Think about what that means. Elrond sent him out into the wild, not just to learn the world, but to learn himself, to discover, under conditions of genuine stress and genuine danger, whether the blood of Elendil and Isildur and all the kings of Númenor that ran in his veins was enough. whether the weight of that lineage could hold against the weight of the world as it actually was. And the testing was 87 years long. Imagine any process of self-examination sustained for 87 years. Imagine any question about your own nature put to the test of daily practical reality for nearly a century. What you learn, after that long, is not a confident answer. It is something more nuanced than a confident answer. It is the specific knowledge of exactly where your strengths are reliable and exactly where they are not. It is the understanding, earned the hard way, of what you can be trusted with and what you cannot. It is wisdom, and wisdom is never the same thing as certainty, and wise people who are certain should worry you. Aragorn, by third age 3018, was a man who knew himself with extraordinary precision. He knew what he could endure, because he had endured it. He knew what he would do under extreme pressure, because he had done it. He knew what kinds of temptation could reach him and what kinds could not, because he had walked through enough of both to have developed reliable instincts. But what he did not know, what perhaps no one could know after 87 years of that particular formation, was whether the self he had discovered through all that testing was Aragorn, or whether it was the man Aragorn had become through all those years of being someone else. This is not a trivial distinction. This is the distinction that matters. Picture this: the path of the dead, third age 3019, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and the Rangers of the North, following the paths of the dead under the haunted mountain to summon the Oathbreakers. No natural light, the walls pressing close, the shadows ahead of them not empty, the ghosts of men who had broken their oath to Isildur, gathering in response to the voice of Isildur's heir. Aragorn has been here before, not this specific place, not this specific darkness, but a darkness like this. He has walked in places where the enemy's influence was thick in the air and in the ground, where the accumulated spiritual weight of thousands of years of wrong allegiance was inscribed in the landscape itself. He knows this darkness. He has learned to move through it without breaking, and now he is calling on his name. His real name, the name that 3,000 years of history have been building toward. He is speaking as Aragorn Elessar, as the heir of Isildur, as the rightful king of Gondor. And the ghosts are responding, not to his capability, which they cannot assess, but to his name, which they recognize because it is woven into the oath they broke. He can do this because of what the 87 years made him, not despite them. The operational discipline, the self-erasure, the sustained campaign in shadow, all of it contributed to the man who can walk into that darkness and speak with enough authority that the dead come to heal. The self-erasure was not opposed to the claiming, it was the preparation for it. But here is what nobody asks about that moment. What did it feel like for Aragorn to finally say his own name and have it do something? He had been suppressing that name, hiding it, giving it away only in careful, controlled doses for most of his life. And now he is saying it in the full weight of what it means, in a situation where the name itself carries structural power in the fabric of the world, and the dead are moving in response. After 87 years of being Thorongil and the Wanderer and Strider and the chief of a hidden people, what does it feel like to discover that your actual name has that much weight behind it? Tolkien does not tell us, because Aragorn, characteristically, does not put it in the record. The emotional crescendo of this whole long argument lives here, in what is not recorded. Think about the rangers who died in Aragorn's service, the Dunedain who fell guarding roads the hobbits never knew were guarded, companions who went with him to the east and did not come back, or came back changed, or came back alone after decisions that Aragorn had to make, and that the situation required, and that he will carry forever. There is no monument to them, no record in the appendices, no chapter in unfinished tales. They are part of the 87 lost years, and the 87 lost years are almost entirely off the page. This is not a failure of Tolkien's imagination. It is a reflection of Aragorn's character. The king who finally claimed the throne of Gondor was the same man who had spent nearly a century ensuring that the most important work he ever did left no trace. The discipline of the Shadow Campaign was the discipline of erasure, and the erasure was total. Think about Frodo, asking Aragorn at some point on the road, some quiet moment, what he had done with all those years. Think about what Aragorn would have said. Not the full truth. Never the full truth. Maybe an outline, maybe a careful selection of details designed to give Frodo what he needed to understand without overwhelming him with what he did not need to carry. Aragorn told the Fellowship enough to be trusted. He told Arwen enough to be loved. He told Elrond enough to be confirmed as ready. But the full accounting, the complete record of what those 87 years cost, and contained, and changed, he kept. He always kept it. And now it is lost. Not lost in the sense that it happened and was forgotten. Lost in the sense that it was never fully put into words in the first place. Aragorn was the kind of man who knew that some things, once spoken, become smaller than they were when they lived only in the person who carried them. And so he carried them. This brings us back to the question this video opened with, returned now in its full weight. Did Aragorn conceal the full truth of his 87 years from the people he loved because he was protecting them from the scale of what he knew, or because, after nearly a century of living as someone else, he was no longer entirely certain where those years ended and Aragorn began? The honest answer is both, and neither, and the distinction between them may not be as clear as the question makes it seem, because protecting someone from the scale of what you know and not being entirely sure how to translate that knowledge back into your own name are not separate things. They are the same thing experienced from two different angles. The man who keeps the full truth locked inside him, whether from discipline or from uncertainty, is the same man. The motivation is almost irrelevant compared to the result. And the result is the most heroic and most lonely figure in Tolkien's entire legendarium. A man who spent 87 years doing the foundational work that made the War of the Ring winnable before the War of the Ring began, who did it in silence and under false names and without recognition, who came back from the east and the south and Gondor's harbors and the unnamed roads of the wild north, and became, finally, a king, and who never, in any record that survived him, fully explained what any of it had cost. There is a thing Tolkien does in the tale of Aragorn and Arwen that I have been circling around this entire time and want to finally name directly. After Aragorn's death in 4th Age 120, Arwen goes to Seren Amroth, the hill in Lorien where she and Aragorn had pledged themselves to each other. She lays down there and dies, and Tolkien writes, in some of the most quietly devastating prose in the entire legendarium, that she gives up the Evenstar, the star of her people, and that she goes into the twilight. She knows. She always knew. She chose Aragorn knowing that this would be the end, that the mortal lifespan she was joining by choosing him would end like this, in grief that no elvish nature was designed to survive. She chose it with her eyes open, with full knowledge of the cost, and she chose it because Aragorn was worth the cost. But she was choosing Aragorn, not Thorongil, not the Wanderer, Aragorn. And the Aragorn she chose was the man the 87 years had made him, the man who had been everywhere and said little about it, the man who had burned Umbar's ships and walked away, the man who had looked at the peoples of Rhûn and Harad and seen them clearly and never simplified what he saw, the man who had practiced self-erasure for so long that claiming himself was the hardest thing he ever did, and he did it, finally, for her and for his people, and for a world that had no idea what it had taken to get here. She knew this man. She loved this man, and the love she chose tells you more about what those 87 years made him than any record of the years themselves could. Here is what this all means. Not just for Aragorn, for the question of what Tolkien was actually writing about in The Lord of the Rings. The trilogy is frequently read as a story about the victory of good over evil, about fellowship and courage, and the small things that matter against the great darkness. And it is all of those things. But the 87 lost years reveal another layer, a layer about what victory costs before it happens. About the invisible labor that makes the celebrated triumph possible. About the men and women who do the work that nobody records, who hold the line that nobody knows is there, who spend their strength and their years in shadow so that others can live in light. The Rangers of the North, unnamed companions in Rhûn and Harad. The soldiers of Gondor who trusted Thorongil without knowing who he was. These are the people the appendices gesture toward and then pass by, and Aragorn is not separate from them. He is the culmination of them. He is what it looks like when a person makes the Ranger's choice, over and over, for an entire lifetime, until the moment arrives when the choice is no longer to serve in shadow, but to step into light. And even then, stepping into light, claiming the kingship he had been born to, becoming LOTR before the gates of Minas Tirith, he brought the shadow with him, not as darkness, as depth, as the specific quality that Elrond recognized when he said, "You have grown." The quality of a man who has tested himself against the real weight of the world for 87 years and come through it knowing exactly what he is and what he is not, and who finds that knowledge both strengthening and, in some quiet, permanent way, saddening. Wisdom is almost always a little sad. This is true in Tolkien's world, and it is true in the actual world, because wisdom requires loss. It requires having wanted something and understood why you could not have it. It requires having been wrong and living with what the wrongness cost. It requires having seen the enemy clearly enough to understand him, and understanding the enemy clearly enough is never comfortable, never clean, never the same as the uncomplicated hatred that makes war feel simple. Aragorn carried that wisdom for 87 years before anyone asked him to carry a fellowship through Moria. And when he walked into that cave, when he led them into the dark with the authority of a man who has been navigating various forms of darkness for most of his adult life, he was not pretending to be capable of this. He simply was, because the 87 lost years had made him so. And now the question returns, one final time, in the form it has been building toward since the first paragraph. Not, did Aragorn conceal the truth because he was protecting them, or because he was no longer sure where those years ended and he began? Deeper than that. After 87 years of invisible service, after Thorongil and the Wanderer and the nameless chieftain of a depleted people, after Rhûn and Harad and Umbar, and every unnamed road, and every unnamed companion, and every decision made in the dark without the consolation of recognition, after all of that, when Aragorn LOTR finally stood before the gates of Minas Tirith and claimed the name that all of it had been preparing him for, was that moment of claiming a triumph? Or was it, for him, in the deepest and most private part of himself that no record ever reached, something closer to grief? Grief for everything those 87 years contained that the triumph would now permanently overshadow. For the Rangers who would be remembered, if at all, only as the people who produced the king. For Thorongil, who had been real in his own way, who had earned love and loyalty, and the trust of men under his own false name, and who would now be absorbed into the footnote of Aragorn's becoming. For the man he had been in Rhûn, sitting beside a fire in enemy territory, watching people he could not save, going about lives he could not change, and understanding, slowly, the full and terrible depth of what the enemy had built there over 3,000 years. All of that is in the king who walks through those gates. None of it is in the record. The most heroic thing Tolkien's greatest mortal hero ever did might be precisely this. He held everything those 87 years contained, held it completely, with the full weight of Númenórean endurance and Dúnedain discipline, and whatever specific quality of being Elrond recognized and called growing, and he carried it into the kingship, and he let the kingship absorb it, and he never asked anyone to know the cost. He was, at the end, exactly what the Rangers of the North had always been. a guardian of something precious, whose greatest achievement was that the people he protected never needed to understand what he had protected them from. This is what the 87 lost years actually were. Not a gap in the story, not a period of wandering to be filled with backstory. The fullest expression of everything Aragorn was, acted out in shadow, across 87 years, for an audience of almost no one, producing a result that looked, to everyone who witnessed it, like a destiny finally fulfilled. But it was never destiny. Destiny is something that happens to you. What Aragorn did was chosen, every day, under every false name, across every road and harbor and foreign camp, and unknown territory, for 87 years. That is what was lost to the page. That is what the evasiveness of Appendix A was protecting, not by accident, but because Aragorn himself would have protected it, because he was the last person who would have wanted the full accounting made, because the discipline of the Shadow Campaign was the discipline of a man who understood, in his bones, that some things are made smaller by being spoken, and made larger by being held. He held it for 87 years, and then he became king, and then, eventually, he went into the twilight like all mortal things, and the 87 years went with him, mostly unrecorded, mostly unknown, mostly, because here we are, talking about it. Following the threads that Tolkien left in the appendices, and the letters, and the dense archaeology of unfinished tales, trying to reconstruct from hints and chronological gaps, and a single line from Elrond, the shape of what those years contained. And maybe that is the final thing to say about it. That the 87 years are not truly lost. They are hidden. Hidden in plain sight, in the character of the man who came back from them, in every choice he made, and every word he withheld, and every moment he stepped forward, and every moment he chose, carefully and deliberately, and with full awareness of what he was doing, to step back. They are in him. They are in every scene, every line, every silence. You just have to know where to look. If this opened something for you that you did not know was closed, I want to hear it. Because the question of what those 87 years actually cost Aragorn, what they built, what they buried, and whether the man who finally claimed the throne was more or less complete than the 20-year-old who walked out of Rivendell into the wild, that question does not have a single answer. It has the kind of answer that changes depending on what you bring to it, and that is exactly the kind of question worth arguing about. Drop your reading in the comments. Tell me what those years look like to you. Tell me if you think the king at the gates of Minas Tirith was triumphant, or carrying something, or both. Tell me if you think Aragorn knew the full answer to what he was, or if the not knowing was part of what made him what he was. If you want to keep going deeper into the parts of Tolkien's world that the films passed over and the books left in shadow, this is the channel for it. Subscribe, and we will keep opening doors.